Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vivian MacDonald, and I would like to welcome you all to the first installment of the Living Foundations Conversation Series presented by the Halifax Public Libraries. I live and work here in Jabuktuk, Halifax, and am employed by the housing sector, focusing on reducing chronic homelessness and associated barriers in the urban Indigenous population. I would like to acknowledge that we gather here for this event today on the traditional and unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq people. We respectfully honor our elders, past, present, and future, and all those who have stewarded these lands for generations. I've seen and experienced firsthand the housing crisis that we are all facing and the housing inequities that are negatively impacting our community. This conversation series will provide the community with a new outlook and an innovative, inclusive approach to public housing. Obtaining safe and secure housing is the foundation for individual well-being, and in the larger context, the community's well-being. Individual community members at the libraries across the province have provided first-person statements when asked, "How do you feel about your current housing situation?" And these voices have been collected and compiled into a short video that has been prepared for you today.
Welcome to the library. Tonight, we are going to start a conversation.
$635 on disability for rent, and most one-bedrooms are $1,000 to $1,500. Even with your check for food, you still couldn't afford choosing life. I'm worried.
To get the conversation started, we asked you, what do you wish people knew about your housing situation? Here's what you shared with us.
Living in an old apartment building, we have lots to be concerned about. Mice, bedbug scares. If housing wasn't so expensive, we'd move.
I work 2 jobs and live in a small, 3rd-floor walk-up with 2 roommates. My apartment is unusually cheap. Rent is still over 1/4 of my annual income.
I am university educated and work hard at a full-time job, but still struggle to put a roof over my family's head.
I'm not sure we can take another price jump or for either one of us to get injured or super sick.
At 34 years of age, live in a tent, no power, food, or anything else to survive.
We are a family of 3 and had to sell our house because of increasing rent and inflation. But when we went to look for an apartment, it became a challenge, as even after being employed for a long time in Nova Scotia and having a good credit rating, our application was rejected.
Housing is essential to people's lives. Housing is the foundation upon which we all live our lives. It provides us safety, security, warmth, privacy, and a place to recharge. And housing is and needs to be supported as a human right.
I hope that the community comes together and starts to explore community-based solutions to the issue of housing affordability.
What we really need is to have these community conversations to change what are some of the current rules around housing. What we really are looking at is empowering citizens to make changes and to be part of the solution.
And many of us know and have experienced ourselves what it's like to be living in Halifax with the current housing climate and affordability rates. So in saying that, I would like to introduce our guest speakers, keynote Jayne Engle and Frank Palermo. Jayne is the co-director of Participatory Cities Canada, which is the sister organization of Everyone Every Day, Jabuktuk, Halifax, which is a project of the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Centre. The organization aims to create social infrastructure that incorporates cultural diversity and participatory action within our communities, utilizing a decolonized approach that better suits our current society and ways of being. Jayne is an adjunct professor at the McGill School of Urban Planning with experience in building capacity within community and has recently co-authored Sacred Civics, Building 7-Generation Cities. And Frank Palermo is currently a member of HRM's Urban Design Task Force, a fellow of both the Royal Architecture Institute of Canada and the Canadian Institute of Planning. Frank is a vocal advocate for community-centered approaches to urban design. Public sector reform is a daunting task that many are hesitant to address, But does this come at the cost of our greater community's foundational needs, such as affordable housing? With a focus on sustainability and participatory approaches, Jayne will challenge you to broaden your view of what housing could look like and the holistic benefits that inclusivity and diversity have on the greater community. And I'd like to welcome Jayne up to speak now.
Hi, everyone. It is so great to be here, and I want to start by just thanking Ken and Cheryl and others for this invitation. And I love the library and this library system. In case you don't know, Halifax really stands out across this country for the library, the system, the kind of leadership it takes. And I want to thank you for the invitation and also for taking a leadership role in asking this question: what should housing be? And I love that the library is asking this, and really honored to be here and to kick off this series, and with an invitation to aim higher, for us to imagine together what could be possible in terms of changing the systems that underlie the problems of housing, and to think about what kind of responsibility and direct engagement that we might be able to take as well. So really just thrilled to be here. A couple of words of context is, this is a time, as we all know, any of us who read the news, you know it's a time of immense change, right? This is a societal and civilizational moment, really. We're facing some challenges that we have historically never faced, either as a region here, but also in a planetary context. So in some ways, that is incredibly daunting, and we all know that it affects our health, particularly mental health, and so on. At the same time, it's also a moment where it's so clear that change is needed, that sometimes possibility for change is more possible. So let that be this kind of moment. So this talk will be split into two parts before Frank and I open up discussion. So the first part of the talk is really based on the book that was mentioned. So we have this book called Sacred Civics, Building 7th-Generation Cities, which is about imagining shaping cities as if people, land, and nature were sacred. And we'll talk about what that could mean, including what that could mean for redesigning our housing systems. And then the second part will be about changing the questions we ask about housing, of course, starting with this one, and also some even deeper questions and some questions about the possibilities moving forward. All right. So first of all, Sacred Civics, it's a book that I'm a co-editor of and a co-author, but there are actually 25 of us who have contributed to this book, including one person that many of you will know. She's down on the bottom, Pam Glode-Desrochers, who's of course Executive Director of the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center. She and Tessie Britton and I co-authored one of the chapters in the book called Social Infrastructure for Our Times, which is about the participatory city approach as an approach to decolonizing systems, practices, and mindsets, and then valuing the creativity of everyone in ways that are inclusive. And of course, this is manifesting right down the street in the Everyone Everyday project, which started recently. The important thing is that we wanted to do here is we wanted to have what we call a pluriversal set of views. So the people who have contributed to this come from very different parts of the world, different worldviews, different walks of life. We have a number of Indigenous authors, and we also have authors from many other backgrounds as well, but we do center quite a bit Indigenous knowledges and wisdoms and ways of being, seeing, knowing, and doing, and sort of adapting that across other kinds of cultures and contexts, and we hope to make for a rich mix of ways of looking at things differently. So I want to start with a couple of quotes really to set the tone and the ambition for our discussion and for our collective thinking here. So the first one is that everything about our housing system has been designed by people over time. There is nothing about it that is sacred natural law, right? So the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something we could just as easily make differently. So all of the assumptions we have, all of the rules, all of the legal aspects, those are socially constructed and they can change. And that's important for us to remember. Even when governments say we can't do this because of this rule, actually, those can change. And I would argue that in many cases they need to. So that's really important for us to recognize. The second quote is by a woman named Tara Huska. She is an Indigenous lawyer and a land defender. And we use this quote as the epigraph of chapter 1 of the book because it's so central to how we want to frame how we think about city building, including housing systems of the future. So I'm going to read it. The sacred is all around us, always. The sacred is in each of our bodies, a miracle of life and water and earth. It's present in every object we touch, every wall and window we somehow believe separates us from our mother. We each hold the beauty of creation in every fiber of our being. We're never far from the answer to the problem we've created. It's within each of us. So from here, I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by sacred civics more specifically. So it's an invitation. It's an invitation to imagine shaping cities, as I said, as if people, lands, and natures were sacred. So what if we imagined that each person who was quoted in that beautiful opening video, we imagined that each person who is dealing with housing challenges, housing difficulties, all of us, what if each person was seen as worthy of dignity and empathy, respect, a life of flourishing? What if infrastructures of food, transport, housing, economic systems, etc., were conceived to be in relationships of reciprocity with natural ecosystems essential for life? So we're inviting that we reconsider city building, including housing systems, with sacredness as a foundation. And all kinds of possibilities flow from that, including how we law together. And I intentionally use the word law there as a verb. Many of you will know that in many Indigenous legal systems, law is a verb, and what that represents also is that we are all responsible to law together. Law is not something done to us. It's not something outside that's fixed. We can actually be the co-creators of law, and I think that's something that we need to very much embrace for the world that we're moving into. I want to stress too, sacred can be a problematic word. I want to acknowledge that. Here, we don't mean sacred in a context of formal religion or manifestations. Rather, we mean the intrinsic worthiness of people, of life, the worthiness of people for dignity, relationality, for all life, and that we are all unique and that we're defiant of commodification. And the four elements specifically is that sacredness and sacred civics represents a deep care for common good, a sacred responsibility for us to care for each other and for nature in perpetuity. So this cannot be about short-term change, right? We need to think about housing for the long term, right? Not about just fixing it for the current crisis, but actually how can we rebuild a system that will be good for 7 generations from now? How can we have a more relational worldview, a sense of shared purpose about the future, and what we would call an earth spirituality? And at the heart of sacred civics is really this notion of holism. We are all beings who have intellectual dimensions, emotional, physical, as well as spiritual dimensions, and that needs manifestations in city life. And finally, sacred civics involves having really aspirations for higher level responsibility and accountabilities. So right now, we have a very strange situation where even our governments, no organization, none of our institutions actually have accountabilities for the health of nature, or for the health of future generations, right? That's actually not even built into our systems. So how can we expect to change things if that's not even built into our systems? So we argue that we need to have different systemic accountabilities to future generations, to the health of the earth, to the designed world, meaning the circularity. So in housing construction, what happens to housing materials when housing is torn down, for example? We actually need to be designing housing and building construction materials for circularity, and to all people, not just a select few within a certain set of borders, right? And this is a diagram in chapter 1. We've talked about the accountabilities on the outside, and the center is the holistic aspect. And the three, the in-betweens part on values, wisdom, and commons, those are what we consider to be dimensions of transformation that need to be enacted. So values, or valuing differently. So what we currently value now, for example, is housing as an investment, right? Whereas housing should be a place to live. And yet, it's primarily an investment, and it's one of the reasons that housing has become as financialized as it has. So housing, what about housing as a place to live? That it references how we value. Commons and commoning has to be much more present. I'm not going to talk about it a lot today, but there's a lot about commoning in the book. And then wisdom, we'll come to in just a moment. So another aspect of value is that it's about moving primarily, thinking about GDP as the measure of progress. So that is one set of measures that some argue measure everything but that which really matters. Well-being matters, well-being of life, of people. And then this, the wise Prime Minister of New Zealand said, economic growth accompanied by worsening social outcomes is not success, it's failure. And yet that's not really how we value currently, right? Second, on the commons, I just want to point to, like I said, I'm not going to go in depth on the commons here, but some outstanding work on seeing the city as a commons is by Sheila Foster and Christian Ioni. They're some of the most prolific authors on the topic. They have a new book out called Co-Cities, give all kinds of examples from around the world about how we can think differently in response to the question of who owns the city. Because if the response to that question is that we all should, then what does that mean in terms of how we organize ourselves, who owns what and why, et cetera? Not sure what happened there. Just give it a second. Okay. There it is. Okay. So wisdom. What is a wise question to ask if we think about how we should be redesigning our systems now? We argue that a central question is, how can we build the physical, digital, social, institutional infrastructures so that children in 7 generations or more will thrive in an equitable, regenerative city? That's actually how we need to be designing our systems now. This is a good time to do that in Halifax, right? I mean, I'm not going to speak much about the details of Halifax because you all know, I'm not from Halifax, you all know it far better, and I'll be speaking a little bit later with some people who are well embedded here. But I do know enough to know that the crisis is very real here, as it is, of course, in many places across the country, not to mention around the world. It's a good time to question everything. Speaking of questioning everything, we argue that there are 3 core assumptions. There are others, but these are 3 core assumptions that we need to bust and that we need to challenge in order to think differently about cities for the future. So one is that in our society, you could argue that we've quasi-sacralized property ownership, right? It's seen, in fact, the economist Thomas Piketty argues that we've quasi-sacralized it to the point that even though we recognize there are all kinds of externalities that result from property ownership, we still consider it to be a higher good, and therefore we accept the externalities. Second, corporations, we accept that they're not really in service of the public good. So for the most part, many corporations, they have a very different set of demands. They serve shareholder interests, in some cases stakeholder interests, but in the world we need to build now, shouldn't we expect more of our corporations to serve the public interest? And then last one, jurisdictions and sovereignties. They should not be seen as fixed. So it's not good enough that one level of government will say, that's not our responsibility, it's another, it's someone else's responsibility, right? There are so many challenges we have because of jurisdictions and sovereignties as they are. So in many cases, those need to be challenged. Okay, so I want to open now to the second part, which is really just about raising additional questions, sort of deepening the kinds of questions we asked. And I will give some examples of ways to do that. And some of these examples are, some of those we won't go through in detail here, but I just wanted to put them on the table, particularly as provocations and also ways to imagine for the rest of the series, recognizing that this is just the beginning of the series. What should housing be? What and who is the city for, and who owns the city? Second set of questions. What if everyone had access to a good place to live? What would that invite, and what would it require? Third, what if we treated housing primarily as a place to live, as a basic human need, rather than as a wealth-building asset? What could become possible? And fourth, what if communities had agency and capabilities to co-design homes in the housing system? What if communities had agency and capabilities to co-design homes and the housing system? So it's primarily that question that we're going to look at some possible examples to build from. And all of these are also about taking into account higher level accountabilities and responsibilities that I referenced before. And then one last question that occurred to me is that every time I come to Nova Scotia, I hear people talk about we are all treaty people. And I wonder what that really means, and what should that mean now in the context of the housing crisis, right? What does that mean, and what does that invite? I'm really curious. I'd love some discussion on that. Okay, so what could be next? A few minutes. I have a bunch of examples. I'm not going to go in depth in all of them, but I want to just give a couple examples in each of these categories. So where could Halifax start? These are just a few examples in imagining what's possible, in creating the kinds of mechanisms, maybe the institutional frameworks that could open up some possibility, and then building what we call system demonstrators. And I'll explain what we mean by that in a moment. So imagining the future of housing, so engaging people in constructing alternative futures. So imagination is one of the challenges of our times, I would argue, right? We have accepted things too much the way they are. We are on a journey. We accept the status quo because it seems too hard to change it. At the same time, there's an opportunity to, especially with this invitation, to open up a very different line of inquiry into what could be possible. And I've referenced in the middle section of each of these, I've referenced chapters in the book that might touch on this subject. Of course, there are many other sources, and we've referenced some other sources, but these are some of the chapters that reference imagining what's possible. I'll give a couple of the examples at the bottom. I have slides for each one, and I'll just highlight a couple. So this is an example of a housing development. I'm curious if people has anybody heard of this yet? The Senok development? Yeah. So this is actually on Indigenous lands adjacent to the city of Vancouver. It's the Squamish Nation lands, and it will be the largest net zero housing development on the lands that we call Canada. And it is 7,000 units or so, mostly rental housing that will be fully held by the Squamish Nation. I'll quickly say this. So Berlin is exploring how, if they used all of the housing throughout the city, installed rooftop gardens to grow food, what that would look like, what would be possible. Going to skip a couple of these. This one, I just want to point out how co-living is really growing as a trend. And co-living, in some cases, it involves primarily millennials and other young people, but there are lots of kinds of co-living that involves intergenerational living too. And I think there are whole new ways that we can construct housing differently in order to allow for co-living, where people can share much more. And I think a lot of imagination was opened up during COVID for that possibility, and we realized how there could be great benefits through co-living in different ways. Okay, second is the mechanisms to test and demonstrate possibilities. So what could be some of the infrastructures we create in order to do some of the kinds of experimentation or systems challenges or systems change that we're talking about? So I'm gonna skip this. Any of these we could come back to in questions, or you can contact me later. I want to mention this one specifically because this is one that doesn't require any government intervention. It could be done by people anywhere. And it was actually done in Vancouver. The 30 Network was an initiative to bring together 30 people under 30 years old to together address over a series of about 6 sessions in 2 months a deep critical issue in the city. And the first one they addressed was housing affordability. And with housing affordability, what 30 young people did was they figured out, okay, what could we do in response to that with a small sum of money? I think they each got each team had about $10,000 to actually put together a response to the affordable housing crisis. And just one example of what one of the teams put together is they created an app, a platform to match people, mostly elderly people or empty nesters who had rooms in their homes that they wanted to rent out to people. But rather than doing it through Airbnb or some other platform like that, they did it locally in a way that they could be matched with either students or other people in need of housing, and could match and created a platform for people who needed a place to live with people who had available space in their homes. So really, in a way, a simple, practical thing, but having those kinds of things locally driven can be so much better than actually having a centralized platform. Housing Innovation Lab, I don't know if anyone's, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if anyone is here from HRM, this is something that could be done within city government, or it could even be a hybrid lab with 1 foot inside city government, 1 foot outside. In this case, the Boston Housing Innovation Lab was funded by the Bloomberg Philanthropies to put together an innovation team. And they've created all kinds of experiments and pilots to address the housing crisis in that city. I think it was Kevin who mentioned right to housing. I'm not going to go into detail here, but I'll just say that the idea of the right to housing is that everyone should have a right to live somewhere in peace, security, and with dignity. And Leilani Farah is head of an organization called The Shift. By the way, if you haven't seen the film called The Push, the link to it is there. Anybody can watch it free anytime. It's actually about the global housing crisis, but it also has some examples from Canada. but this is really about looking at housing differently as a right. And this organization has also been involved in work, especially addressing encampments in cities, including developing with the City of Toronto a policy for encampments in cities. And I know that they've had some attention to Halifax, of course, but I'm not sure if they've actually been involved with HRM or not. Okay, this is We Can Make Housing, citizen-led housing. I'm not going to go into detail. Some of these, again, I just wanted you to have quick reference to, but I won't go into them in detail. Just two more quick examples that I want to give. But first I want to say what I mean by system demonstrators, because I think this is really important. We have all over the place, there are pilot projects, there are experiments of housing, of other kinds of city interventions. But what we found is that so many of these projects are what we call beautiful exceptions. They don't actually change systems, and they aren't scaled or adapted in other places. So the idea of a system demonstrator is that, yes, you do some sort of pilot project or experiment that shows a different way a system could change. And at the same time you do that, you actually work on the systems underneath. So you change the financial systems, the legal systems, the accounting systems, the regulatory regime that actually would allow such a great pilot project or demonstration to be adapted and replicated in other places. So that's what we mean by system demonstrator. I'll just show two quick examples and then I'll move to close. So one is about a community land trust idea. I think there's a little bit of talk of community land trusts here in Halifax. One of the most famous ones on this continent, and one of the very early ones in the US, was Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. It's in Boston. It involves, part of it is a community land trust that protects 30 acres of land in a couple of neighborhoods of Boston that has established a set of permanently affordable homes as well as permanently affordable rental housing, urban farm, parks, open spaces, commercial lands, and so on. And it's really made a huge difference over time because it was established quite a long time ago. We've been able to follow how it's evolved and changed over time. And so this kind of thing can be adapted in many other places. And I'm always surprised that there aren't more of these in cities. I'm not sure why there aren't more, but it's certainly an opportunity. And the last one I want to mention, I just love this one, is called biodiversity building. So biodiversity building, this is actually being constructed in Finland, and it's being constructed by an organization called the Y Foundation. And the Y Foundation happens to be, I think it's the largest provider of affordable rental housing in Finland, and it also builds a lot of housing for people who were formerly experiencing homelessness. And so this building in particular has a goal also of giving tenants the opportunity to dramatically decrease their carbon budgets. So if you know anything about carbon budgets, I'm not sure what the number is in Canada. In the US, I think we use something like 16 tons per year. It's probably similar in Canada. The European average is 7.2 tons. They're designing this so that people could actually have a carbon budget of 2 tons. And it would be by also managing the biodiversity of the site, growing food on the site, et cetera. And of course, the construction materials that are used. Microtreaties with the earth, I'm not going to talk about it now, but if people are interested, I'd love to share what we're talking about by this possibility, because it would be wonderful to do something like this in Halifax. It's really about, it's about land either belonging to a community land trust, or it could actually be about creating an opportunity for self-sovereign land, right? Something that would be consistent with a lot of Indigenous worldviews about us being in relationship to land rather than in an ownership position with land. Free house is another example. All of this is in a lot of detail, also in the book. I'm not going to take time to talk about it now. I just want to end with this. I was on a jury for a student housing essay competition last year, and the one that won made a great set of arguments for how to address the housing crisis in Canada. And it involved building massively cooperative housing in Canada, among a number of other strategies. Chris's point was, to effectively address Canada's housing crisis, we have to look beyond the market and pursue democratic, community-centered policies. So far too much of our housing is based on market-led approaches. And as we can see, that's actually not going to work to get us where we need to go. So, we'll leave you with this question, and to start our discussion: how can Tjipuktuk Halifax be a leader in finding ways forward to address the question, what should housing be, and related ennobling questions to create a 7-generation city? That's it. Thanks very much. Sure.
So, first of all, I want to thank you, Jayne. It's inspiring, you know, to just hear words that come from a point of view that says it's possible to make change. It's possible to think in a different way. It's possible to imagine that there are many opportunities around us. We just haven't found the right way to capture it. And the other part of that is there are so many obstacles in the way. There are so many obstacles that try to keep everything in its lane, that try to keep us from imagining, really, you know, what it is that we'd like to see happen. And I have to say, you know, that for me, one of the saddest things that I've come to realize is that one of the professions that I'm really quite intimately connected with is the largest proponent of actually squashing expectations. I think planning, generally, the way it's practiced, even here, but around the world, in many, many places, is really this idea that it's a voice for what it is that people in power, you know, our political leaders really want to see. It's a way of keeping, you know, a smooth kind of road. I know that many people call for public participation. Participatory democracy is a big word, you know, within planning organizations, you know, et cetera. But generally, you know, my experience is that what planners have been doing for years is squashing expectations, telling us why we can't do things, as opposed to helping us to imagine what it is that we could do. Because if all of our expectations are squashed, you know, are put in place, or are aligned with, you know, an existing kind of point of view about, you know, profit, for instance, being, you know, the reason why corporations exist, the reason that developers are here, you know, to do their jobs, or that, you know, the idea of a long-term view is actually inconsistent with what it is that most politicians are really after. That is, you know, to produce results immediately so that they can show that to the people that elected them and they could get re-elected. And so long as planning kind of sees itself, you know, as an arm of government, and responsible not to the public interest, which I think is actually written in many of the codes that planners put together, that is, that we're about the public interest. So long as planning kind of sees itself kind of in that way, I think, you know, they would be there must be some planners in the room here, they might be astounded to think that they're really, I have to include myself, we have really been villains in this piece so far. So one of the institutional changes that needs to happen is that, in fact, and it's not just planning. I'll talk about the architects in a minute as well. One of the real things that has to happen is that we have to change the mindset, not just our own mindsets in terms of being allowed, to imagine what it is that could be, but also the mindset and the kind of potential that exists, professional potential that exists, to actually help us to imagine. That's what planning is really about, isn't it? It's trying to imagine, working with people, trying to imagine the future that they aspire to, that takes advantage of the assets that they have, and actually builds, a more inclusive, much happier, much more generous, much more prosperous kind of environment and social system and economic system and personal dignity system and all of those things. That is what it is that we all want to do. If we talk to individuals, how could you not say that that's what we want to do? Every plan that I've ever worked on, with a First Nation community, which is a little bit easier, I have to say, in some ways than working with HRM, I actually start with this idea that the notion of community is to actually find a way in which a group of people that have come together could together kind of imagine the future that they want and then find a way to actually build it. Isn't that what planning should really be about everywhere? And I think your talk kind of just inspired me to kind of think, I have to just work harder, to get the institution that I'm part of to actually change and see that. Because I think if those are the values of the institution, that we're much more aligned with this kind of notion of really being able to find some answers to what the housing crisis is about. Because the housing crisis isn't just a moment. I mean, housing is not just a need today. Housing has always been, will always be a need. It's also, one of the basics, it's housing, and it's a place to live and a source of food. I mean, those are the ideas behind the origin of communities and where it is that a community actually started and why a community started and why people kind of came together, because there was an idea that together you could do those two things, meet those two basic needs, and then that opened up people's imaginations in terms of all of the other things that they could do together. That is, build better houses, find a way to imagine how the stars aligned, or imagine the kind of world that their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would want to live in, or imagine a trek that they would make across the country to find, other possibilities for actually kind of inventing a canoe as a way to get from one place to another. It's not like someone gave them a kind of license to do that. It's like people coming together. Once those basic needs are met, it actually kind of opens up, the possibility of people then imagining what more could be done together, right? Because a canoe is not an easy thing, right? It's not something that just comes natural. It's something where you actually have to understand the resources that you have. You have to have a vision of where it is that you want to go, and a notion about how you can put all of those things together in such an unlikely way that at the end of the day, you're actually making progress in many ways. So I think there's a lot to be said for that kind of strategy. I wonder if you have any insights into places where those kinds of institutional or corporate thinking or those kinds of ideas about how it is that we could all benefit, maybe even the corporations could benefit, certainly the professions could benefit by just giving more license to themselves, you know, to actually think in a kind of slightly bigger way.
Yeah. By the way, just before I respond to that, I saw a question in the audience, and I think there's a system for asking questions. Did you already say what it was?
Oh, yeah, maybe you should introduce that.
Yeah. I just don't.
Right.
Okay, great. Yeah, so where is this showing up? You know, it's interesting because, thanks for those comments. One of the things that's really tricky with city governments, right, is that they have this dissonance where on the one hand, governments are, they have a rational expectation to keep people's expectations low, right, because they're service delivery mechanisms, right? So HRM has to deliver services. If they are not picking up the trash or doing, you know, the various services, people are going to complain. So it's in their rational interest just for people to sort of be happy. At the same time, very often our local elected officials are also the supervisionary people, right? And they are also imagining long-term futures for the city. So very often they actually have a dissonance, right? Because they've got to deliver services here, and yet they can't. So it's like this vision that they have seems politically difficult even for them, right? So one of the ideas that we've discussed is the idea of a mayor for the future, who would be kind of in a hybrid situation, working on the long-term vision of the city. And it's interesting because I talked with the chief of staff for a mayor recently about this idea. They loved the idea, but the first question was, who else is doing it, right? Because they need other cities for the political cover, right? But I think it's the kind of idea that some cities are open to. Now, in Canada, you know, we have a situation where municipalities don't have a lot of power relative to provinces. Again, this, you know, isn't written in stone, but in some cases, I think there are going to need to be increasing ways to develop these kinds of hybrid governance mechanisms. So to answer the question, where have things like this happened? Some of the places where it happens is actually where I've seen it the most is either where jurisdictions have both the vision and a greater commitment to longer term change. I mean, one example, one sweetheart of urban planning is Copenhagen, right? A place that was, you know, lots of people don't know that it was a very car dominant city, you know, 50 years ago. And the city had a very explicit commitment over time to become the greatest walking city in the world, which at the beginning was a joke. But actually, they agreed across political lines that every year they would reduce car dependency by a certain percentage, meaning reducing parking, reducing and increasing streets that were not car dominant, that would either be fully pedestrian or some mix. And so over time, they became one of the great walkable cities of the world, but that had to do with a very different kind of political will and also local power. So that's one example.
Right. I suppose even a place like New York might be an example of some of that, you know, in terms of what they're doing in pedestrianizing much of, you know, this city that was a mess in terms of traffic, and just basically saying, why don't we just get rid of the traffic, you know, and make it for people, you know, and everything seems to be working out. They've got this idea of doing it in 25 more streets by 2025, which is just coming up. You know, so it is possible, and that idea actually came a little bit from the bottom and with support from the top, no doubt. So maybe there are more examples now that I think of it in that way.
Yeah.
Maybe there are more examples that that we can think of. In terms of housing in particular, you know, it seems to me that the examples that you showed are kind of like exceptions. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, that they're exceptions to the rule, that's not the normal housing that's actually being built. You know, that they have more of a environmental, you know, kind of agenda, that they have more of a kind of connection to site and land, that they have much more of an agenda to what it is that's shared, you know, between tenants in a building, co-ownership, co-living, co-op, you know, all of those kinds of words, and it seems to me that there has to be a point at which we decide that we go from demonstrators to actually changing the rules, and maybe that has to start somewhere relative to all of that, because the exceptions, at least in this city, in this area, the exceptions are really, really difficult to get through the process, the system, you know, get the system to actually kind of accept those exceptions.
Yeah, yeah, well, exactly. And also, you know, part of that has to do with the fact that the financialization of housing has become so dominant in this country, right? And so we don't have the systemic, the regulatory framework to actually fight against what has become this this mode of operating that really favors housing as an investment. I think it's I just read, I'm not sure what it is in this province. I think in Ontario something like 25% of homeowners own more than one home, right? So and that's not even talking about the corporations that own massive numbers, the real estate investment trusts, all kinds of financialized ways that housing has come to be dominated by forces that have nothing to do with actually providing housing as a affordable place in perpetuity. And one of the challenges is that it's not only bad today, the way our systems are designed is it's going to increasingly become worse over time. So what we're doing now is not only unjust for people today, it's even more unjust for people in the future. And so continuing on the trajectory that we're on is just completely unacceptable. It's just so unjust, and I don't see a way but to dramatically change the situation. And I see increasing numbers of hands going up. So please do write down your questions. I think we're going to be collecting those shortly.
Yeah, yes. The idea is that we'll have a little bit of this discussion and then really be open to questions. And Kevin and Vivian will join us for that part. So maybe I should have mentioned that to start with.
Frank, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your experience, especially working with an Indigenous community nearby, and how that might have been different from your experience with housing in non-Indigenous contexts.
Yes. The wonderful thing about working with an Indigenous community is that there aren't quite as many layers of authority kind of from the people that you're actually talking to making a decision about what it is that's going to happen. The community, the leadership in the community, very much welcomed us into the community to develop a housing kind of project in Wamakuk, in Cape Breton, and so from that point of view, it was like the community actually said, we have a problem, there's not enough housing, the housing that we have doesn't seem appropriate for us, we we don't know how to service more housing, and we don't, and we actually need to find a way so we can do more of it ourselves without being dependent on, government handouts, or even in the end, try to find a way to make housing a kind of community industry, if you want, so that the community is actually, if there is, money that goes into housing, it goes back into, that comes out of housing, it actually goes back into housing and becomes much more self-sustaining, kind of in its own way. So in a way, just welcoming us to the community and giving us this kind of open hand to kind of say, tell us what we might do, And we said, well, we'd like you to imagine what it is, that housing here might look like. And, I think I was telling you a bit earlier, that it took about a year and a half, to actually work with a range, many people, young, old, in between, in the leaders and people who had never been to a public meeting before, talking to people, what is it? Look, listen, and learn, in that kind of spirit. It took about a year and a half, to really together come to a conclusion that, oh, it is possible to think about houses in a different way, that they don't have to be CMHC bungalows kind of stuck in the landscape without kind of any connection to each other, no sense of community, nothing shared, et cetera. So we were actually able together to imagine that the units themselves might actually be smaller than the units that they have for certain people. In exchange for that, there would be a shared building, that we could build that would actually give them facilities and services and ability to accommodate people without any accommodation for short periods of time in this kind of shared building, give them a large kitchen for when they needed it, as opposed to every day when they didn't need a kind of large kitchen at all, give them extra bedrooms where people could actually stay, if they had guests, because their place was actually too small. So it actually changed everything, the way that we conceived of what a unit was and what it wasn't. Also, we were able to work with the community and try to understand what resources, talents, skills, were within the community itself, so it could actually be used to actually build this new housing and this shared building, which in fact was going to take place around the community garden, because they decided that really they weren't using their front yards and backyards very much at all. But if we could put housing that was actually much closer together as opposed to individual houses around this kind of idea of a community garden, that it would benefit the whole community, kind of in that way. Mm-hmm. And then, we found people within the community that, for instance, that there were some carpenters in the community who could participate not just in building these units, and we didn't have to go through the rigmarole that would be involved in many other places about whether they were totally qualified and red hats or blue hats or whatever it is. It's like it was possible to actually work between those kinds of margins in all of that, and we actually identified like business opportunities for groups of people in the building of the houses. For instance, instead of building partition walls in the houses because they want some flexibility in how the house might be used, kind of over time, there was a system of connecting closets that actually defined different parts of the houses. And these carpenters were actually going to start a small business of actually making these things, not just for this housing unit, but for future housing in that community. And they had an idea of actually marketing it to other places. Mm-hmm. So it was this idea of kind of taking housing and seeing economic development potential, new social kind of possibilities coming out of it, and a new kind of environmental agenda, because they didn't really want to pay all of the costs, the energy costs, the upkeep costs of the house, etc., so that this new housing actually took care of all of those things. And money then could be put back into building more housing as opposed to just paying for a heating bill for the houses that existed already. So it was an amazing experience that way. I think I was telling you earlier, the problem was with, layers of bureaucracy outside of the community, in terms of CMHC, which is still kind of manipulating and trying to figure out, how this thing is going to be financed and what their role in it is, and the number of expert signatures that they want, in order to approve the housing itself. But in many ways, I think it's a very enlightening kind of possibility that maybe HRM should experiment with, in some ways. Exactly. Which I think for me raises the question of, do you think that some of the examples that you showed of the co-housing, are really, as we said, exceptions. One of the exceptions is that the design of the units themselves, the house itself is kind of different. And frequently in buildings like that, the units are kind of a bit smaller, and the shared space, what might be a corridor in an apartment building, actually becomes a place that's more like a street, with a kind of vitality to it, some shared services, shared amenities, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. My view is that architects are just not doing enough, to kind of see the world that way, because they too are responding to what the developers tell them that they want. And from a developer's point of view, it's what they call how many doors are there in the building, because every door represents a unit, and the return is a per unit kind of return on their investment. Yeah. This is a different way of actually thinking about housing, which actually thinks about what it is that can be shared and the design of the house itself. And I think architecture needs to start taking more responsibility from that point of view.
Yeah, totally. And I think housing design is going to change a lot. And I think there's going to be a whole lot more modularity in those terms, so that housing can change over time, so that it can be one person to much greater room for growing families or for decreasing, but also having workshop space that's in or adjacent to home, all kinds of making space. So yeah, I think it's going to change a lot to be much more flexible for different kinds of living arrangements. And we do see some of that already, but in many cases, regulations even prevent that. Right. So even places where there is demand for it and where people would like to build it, or it is designed, it's not consistent with existing regulations. So yeah, the regulations, our systems, the developers are really lagging behind what people want and need in many cases. So I see that as a huge challenge. Right.
Yeah. I wonder if we can invite Vivian and Kevin to join us, and we'll try to address questions from the audience or ideas, accept ideas from the audience.
Exactly, that would be great. And just while they do, I just want to acknowledge someone else who's here who I didn't earlier. My dear friend and also co-editor and co-author of Sacred Civics is also here, Tanya Chung-Tiam-Fook. If you can just wave, Tanya. Because I mentioned Pam, who's the only other author who's based in Halifax, but Tanya is here also visiting Halifax for everyone every day and participatory city work. So, thanks.
I'm not sure exactly how this is going to work, Ken, but I'm sure you've got it figured out.
We do have one question that's come in from our live stream. So if you want to start with that.
Yeah, let's okay.
Okay, so this is from the anonymous live stream chat. Are there any systems you know about that doesn't end up working to perpetuate itself instead of for what its original aims are?
It's hard to think offhand because one of the problems is, sorry, Kevin. It looked like I was. systems are very often designed very well to do exactly the outcomes that they are aimed to do. And as I was saying earlier, no systems are designed with future generations in mind, actually. We design very much for short-termism. That's how, over time, we have evolved societally to be very much a short-term society. I'm trying to think of systems, I mean, certainly in nature, right? I mean, natural ecosystems are designed to perpetuate, are designed to change over time. And, you know, it's an interesting thing that hasn't come up already, and that is the fact that cities aren't built in balance with nature, but they could be, right? We very often consider cities as separate from nature rather than nature as fundamental infrastructure of cities. I mean, the only thing that we can't live without, actually, is clean air, clean water, you know, sort of these sacred natural laws. And so these are the kinds of systems, natural systems, that we need to be designing our city systems based on. So nature-inspired, we often call them nature-inspired approaches to design challenges is the kind of, to me, should be the basis of how we do systems design, actually.
And I think it's a good point to say that, like, humanity is in partnership with nature. And so if the base of humanity is in partnership with nature, so too should be our housing and habitats that we occupy.
Right. Can I add something to that as well? The other part of that question that I find intriguing is that more and more there's an understanding that all of the systems and sectoral that generally apply to sectors, a certain kind of part, that, you know, one set of policies actually apply to the natural environment, and another set of policies apply to housing, and another set of policies apply to economic development. And each one of those has a director and, you know, a financial kind of liabilities, you know, et cetera. And the world actually doesn't operate that way. It's a human system that we've put in place that is a way of kind of keeping track of what everyone is doing and making sure that everyone has a very specific agenda of what they're doing. You know, so the housing agenda, for instance, in this province falls under the Minister of Housing and Municipal Affairs, or whatever the title is. You know, he's the person responsible for housing. Trying to convince the Department of Transportation that what they do could really affect housing in very fundamental ways, in terms of allowing more housing to be built in other places which, you know, would have very good transit service, for instance, that actually allows, you know, the people to get to work, you know, et cetera, and provides possibilities. Some of the answers, you know, to the questions that we got from people here were that I have to decide between, you know, I want to stay where I am, but I can't afford it anymore. I have to move somewhere else, but moving somewhere else means I have to buy a car in order to get to work. So you see, there's a link between housing and transportation, and I would say there's obviously there's a link between housing and social services. There's a link between housing and economic development. But no one in government and in these systems that have been set up is actually there to think about these things across sectors. In pursuing, you know, a public transit kind of initiative myself, what I'm finding, the astounding answer from Jennifer Angel, you know, before, you know, that we mentioned before, you know, is that you're going to have to talk to the Premier because he's the only person. That's the only person that would have a kind of more holistic view. And you can't get to talk to the Premier. I've tried.
So the next question is, are you familiar with the Walter Seagull self-built method, and could it work in Halifax? I'm not familiar, so I'm wondering if you're familiar.
I am not.
I am not.
I'm not either.
Okay, next question.
But it sounds like intriguing right now. I'd like to know more. Is there someone who, yeah.
That was my question. I think a Swiss-born architect who worked mostly in Britain in the mid-20th century.
Okay.
And developed this methodology for housing that can be built by people with no construction experience, using basic materials that can be bought at the hardware store.
Yeah, right.
And a lot of the original houses were, they granted permission for council houses to be built that way. They're now millions and millions of pounds in central London. But a lot of late in the 21st century, a lot of co-op housing developments have been built using it. There's one in Brighton in particular. And so I feel that there's not a lot of resources on the internet that actually explain the method. I wonder how many architects are actually still familiar with it or practicing it. And I'm sure that there would be a lot of complications with building codes. That is so inspiring to me, and I wish
That connects a little bit, to the work that we were trying to do in Cape Breton, and CMHC's kind of response to some of it, is that really, it's like common sense, that you would use like local materials and not, highly skilled folks, to build everything, to make everything really, really simple. On the other hand, it's like all of the systems that we've set up right now. For instance, you talk about, low energy or zero energy housing. It gets really complicated really quickly. The number of experts that are there to tell you exactly what a wall should look like. And all of a sudden, the drawing for a wall looks like something that I have trouble reading, to start with. Never mind, just going to buy, some 2x4s or 2x6s, putting them together and building a house and then finding a way, to make that work. It's like technology is actually making all of that kind of idea much, much more complicated. And these layers of, accessibility requirements that, that are beyond common sense, because we all want housing. All housing, I think, should be accessible to start with, but accessibility requirements, code requirements that require things to happen a certain way, and the kind of measures that you have to show in terms of exactly what the energy reduction is, results in this kind of highly technical kind of solutions to things generally, that we have to find a way around that, because otherwise we're moving housing farther and farther away from that idea.
I think there's something in that type of model that relates to the previous question, right? I mean, how do you introduce an evolutionary dynamic into systems, right? You need to kind of invite others into the process. You need to cross-pollinate. You need to kind of, layer influences. It can't, just continue to silo things. This technocratic approach where, the experts are the ones who are going to tell everybody else how to do this one particular thing. It just leads us down an ever-narrowing path, and I feel like, this is to our detriment in a really kind of existential way. Like we are just putting blinders on to possibilities and unable to kind of see the forest for the trees. So, in and of itself, in terms of just opening our minds to possibilities, I think it's a useful kind of model to look into.
And I would just give two super quick responses to that. So one example of self-built housing is called WikiHouse, which you can look up if you haven't already heard of it. It was developed by 00 Architects in the UK, and it's now being adapted in places all over the world, where there are certain designs for WikiHouse that can actually be produced on 3D printers. And people are adapting that in a variety of contexts. And then there's also a lot we can learn from the Global South on self-built housing. And an author who has documented really well some of that work is an architecture professor named Gonzalo Lizarralde. He's at University of Montreal, and he's written quite a bit about self-built housing in the Global South.
I don't know if it was included in your book, but I think I read about an example where some architects or a firm in Los Angeles, I think, reduced the cost of building a unit, cut the cost of building a unit basically in half from what the industry was doing, just through really kind of careful design, using materials in a kind of more conscientious way, et cetera. It might have been somebody at one of the presentations that, the Sacred Cities presentation that happened here as part of the Art of City building that mentioned that example. So I think people are trying some of those things, yeah.
But more is needed, yes, thanks.
So this question asks, what are your thoughts on Airbnb and its impact on the housing supply? And how do we address these short-term rental issues?
I think it's, there's no one answer to that, I guess. In some respects it depends on context, and, in some places Airbnbs have a function. A small town with no hotel infrastructure that's trying to get a tourism industry underway, it can have its advantages. But I think, what we're often dealing with as far as the kind of the effects of Airbnbs is a byproduct, again, of that commodification of housing stock, and how can I extract as much value out of this as possible, and in the meantime, just kind of eliminating the possibility for people to be, comfortably, stably housed over time. It's just, I think Jayne was referring to the lack of legislation, the lack of controls we have in our housing system to ensure that the housing we have is put to work to house people. It's kind of a wild west, and it's just staggering to me that we just aren't getting ahead of these things. We're also sold on the notion of increasing our personal wealth, that in spite of the writing on the wall, we all know where this is going. We know the trajectory we're on, and yet we still refuse to put limits on it. I hope. In my work, I feel like we've been dealing with housing issues for a long time, and there's lots of communities, that have been dealing with this forever, effectively. But we are at a point, I think, where, the crisis is broadening in scope. There are more people being affected by these issues to the extent that I think we're at a point where we may be at a place where people are willing to consider changes to those types of systems, start putting barriers in place. But we've lost thousands of units. I think there was a recent study that a local organization did. We've lost thousands of units in the city to Airbnbs, and by and large, those units are former affordable housing opportunities, and they've been lost to the market. And we started in a hole as far as affordable housing is concerned several years ago, and every day, every month, every year, we're getting deeper into that hole because of these types of influences. So it's something we need to deal with.
Just one more thing on Airbnb. Some of the great research, especially in Canadian housing markets on Airbnb effects, is by a guy named David Walksmith. You might want to look up, whoever asked that question, who details it well, and apparently I understand he is known on a first name basis within Airbnb offices. They're not too pleased with his research. But it's really important, right? Because also municipalities around the world have put into place very different regulatory controls for Airbnb. So there has been lots of testing about different policy and regulatory approaches to it to try to adjust effects of it. However, in addition to those, enforcement is also very often a huge challenge with respect to it. But yeah, it has been, because there are all kinds of ways that Airbnb does have some positive effects, of course, for people who wouldn't be able to afford their homes. They rent out a room and so on, and it can make housing affordable within the current system for some people. But then we also know that in many cases, large corporations own multiple units of Airbnbs and are having all kinds of negative effects on markets in terms of affordability. So yeah, it's certainly not clear-cut.
So, is there any way to deal with the problem of cities needing money from developers, and is it the same situation in other countries?
You say the cities.
So, is there any way to deal with the problem of cities needing money from developers? I'm assuming to develop housing and to create affordable, or not affordable, but units. And is it the same situation in other countries?
Okay, go ahead.
You know, I guess I'm not quite sure if I'm going to answer this exactly, but you know, my feeling is we need to stop relying on for-profit developers to build, you know, the foundational stock of affordable, accessible housing we need. It's just not in their interest to do it. And whether or not, you know, that means dismantling the entire system, I'm really not interested in kind of getting into that at this point. But what I do know is there's a massive gap in terms of development capacity for people who can't afford what private developers are building. I mean, it's just like nobody's doing it at this point. And so I think what needs to happen is municipalities need to start making affordable housing development viable for other entities, right? For nonprofits, for others who want to do this work, to put a system in place in which they're not having to compete at the same level, they're not obligated to, you know, meet the same demands as private developers. I mean, we need to facilitate the development of affordable housing, and we need to give that ability to the people who want to do it and who are going to do it right and do it for the long term, you know, who have the 7 generations type kind of thinking in mind and aren't just doing it, you know, based on a contract that says, you know, if you're going to get this federal, municipal, you know, provincial money, you're going to rent at, you know, what I guess on the books is affordable, at an affordable rate for 15 years, after which, you know, you're just sitting on a gold mine of a real estate portfolio. I mean, we just need to have a system where we're doing this intentionally for the long term and for the right reasons.
Yeah, so totally agree with that. And one thing I'd also add is that a real challenge with Canada's municipal system is that municipalities, for a large part of their revenue, depend on property taxes, right? So they depend on, so housing values going up increases their revenue. So that it's a huge challenge, right? So it's in municipalities' interests for property taxes, or, you know, for property values to go up, because that's where revenue comes from. That is hugely problematic in my view, and not all countries do have that system. So no, it's not the same in all countries. In many countries, municipal revenues are based on a formula. They come from central governments based on a formula that might be about population or other kinds of need, not based on property taxes. So I think that's another opportunity for reform here.
I think the system here isn't, you know, widely shared, you know, in terms of, you know, the way that developers operate. For instance, there's a bonusing system here, which is how, you know, these units get built for the relatively short term. And the developer, in exchange for doing that, is given additional density so that they can actually, it's kind of interesting, right? They build this housing, which, you know, the city considers a public benefit, and in exchange for that public benefit, they're allowed to build even more housing on top of that. So they're actually getting a lot out of the houses that they build for just a relatively short period, and the portion of the, you know, affordable housing sector that they're really dealing with is, you know, a portion that probably needs the least help, you know, in terms of finding housing. I'm much more fascinated with an idea that I think San Francisco had some time ago, which was called inclusionary zoning, you know, which said if you're going to build, you know, so much office space, you're actually going to have, or, you know, workspace or whatever it is, you're actually going to have to provide some money in order to build housing. And we're not interested in you building the housing mostly, just give us the money. And then we'll find, groups within the community that can then leverage that and build the housing themselves. I don't know of a place that's saying that with, housing, condo development, but I think it would be an interesting idea to try out, that is that we all have a responsibility, even developers have a responsibility, to try and meet the real need that exists for housing. So maybe there's a kind of inclusionary part in the mechanism. Take away the bonusing kind of idea and say, or maybe say in exchange for being allowed to do some more, we actually need from you some money to build affordable housing in the right places. And then, as opposed to the city itself trying to build that housing, which has not been generally a good experience in most places that have tried that in a big way, that you actually work with organizations, citizen groups, et cetera, to actually leverage that money and get more housing built. That might be a possibility.
So how can housing be improved outside of city centers in places that are usually more car dependent? And I'm aware that even in places like Sydney and Cape Breton, their rent has just skyrocketed as well. And even might not be to the extent of Halifax and the rent crisis here, but it's still significant to the people who are living in Sydney or even just Truro. Prices in Truro are extremely high now compared to what they used to be.
Yeah. Blame that on COVID. We blame everything on COVID. I think that this part of the world has been discovered in a slightly new way, There's cheap housing, relatively cheap, to people living in Ontario or Vancouver or other parts of the world. There's a lot of it available in rural areas in particular. A lot of people retiring or coming close to retirement age are selling houses at huge prices and finding that even with the higher costs, that they themselves have kind of caused to happen in rural areas here to some degree, even then they could buy a lot of house with just a fraction of the money that they got for their house in Toronto or somewhere else, and basically are retiring here or in some cases even starting new businesses here, because that's kind of the way that mechanism works. And people are discovering that this isn't such a bad place to live in as well, right? So I think that some of that is just more people wanting to live here and discovering that this is a reasonable place and using this resource that they have somewhere else and investing in Nova Scotia in that way. But locally it has exactly, the outcome that you're talking about.
I think, you might give COVID some credit too, because it's really pushed a lot of people and organizations to the point of accepting, work from home scenarios and that type of thing. I think, we're at the point at which rural living is going to change quite dramatically because there's just new capacities, maybe, capacities we've had available to us in theory for a little while now, but, the uptake was limited. COVID really precipitated that type of movement, and, I suspect a real change in rural parts of Nova Scotia over the next period of time because of that capacity, but also because of the inflow of people from other parts of the world. I just don't see that in-migration slowing down anytime soon, and I think a lot of those people are going to see the value in living in a rural area with those remote capacities at their disposal.
So in saying that, what would these co-living concepts look like in smaller and more rural communities?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry.
Well, I think there are starting to be some examples actually in those communities, where, not for people necessarily who need, desperately need housing, but for people who are actually deciding that they want to live in a more rural environment. And so groups of people are actually coming together and starting co-ops, co-housing kind of groups, and actually building housing units. I think there's one in Bridgewater that I've read about. I think they also are starting to talk about them in other places that I'm aware of. So I think that's happening. A lot of those, to be fair, don't look very different from, the other housing, that's being built. But there, we get back to the previous discussions that we've been having. I think that there's a lot of room to actually kind of change that perspective, because I know a lot of people myself who can't find a house right now. The housing market is really, really tight. Can't find a place to live, are choosing, sometimes to live in a rural location. I'm looking at Michael, are choosing to live in a rural location and then facing, all of the difficulties of, commuting back and forth from there to the city. That has huge problems. And for many people like that, it would be reasonable to expect that, they might get together with other people who have similar needs. If only there were a group or an organization or something that can put people together and make this kind of new organizational structure work. And maybe that's one of the things that we can start to imagine kind of happening in this community. Then I think that more of that can happen, and then more focus needs to be placed on, I think, in the work that I'm doing anyway, more focus needs to be placed on what the shared space in those buildings actually means, what it is that, you actually share, work together on, because there I think there's such room, such potential to actually make really rich living environments. It's not just house, it's like what home is all about, what community is all about, and that's the opportunity that exists in all of that. And quite honestly, we're not doing it even in the fanciest condominiums that exist in the city right now. There are people with kids living in those units where, there's no place for the kids to play or to run around, or, there's no place to really have guests, and feel comfortable having them, all of those sorts of things. And here, the co-housing model actually allows an opportunity, to actually find what the benefits are of sharing the shared portions of the building.
So this question asks, what about external factors like climate change and, for example, post-tropical storm Fiona? On the current housing situation, I'm assuming?
I guess I see climate change as playing a kind of a presiding role. It has all sorts of kind of localized effects, people living on the coast and people living in arid regions, and migration out of at-risk areas. There's huge influences there, but I do think that it's actually kind of got a bigger kind of existential function, where I think everybody at this point, for all sorts of reasons, climate change being kind of primary among them, are really reevaluating what we're doing and why we're doing it and how we're doing it and what that's going to look like over the next few generations. I do think that it's kind of intimately tied to housing and how we build cities, where I don't know that people were really thinking along those lines in the past. I think there was a kind of just a general assumption that time would just keep ticking on, and we would continue to progress forever, just ever expanding outwards by some magical means. But all of a sudden, I think people are just becoming aware of the limitations of the resources at our disposal. They're becoming aware of the kind of the relationship between their actions and the impacts on the ecosystems around them. So I just think it's causing people to reevaluate their role, their place, and their impact on the world, and that invariably kind of includes housing and decisions related to it.
Yeah, I would just add, fully agree with all of that. And of course, there's a dimension too about climate migration and climate migration from outside of Canada, which is very interestingly not talked about very much at all in politics because it seems not very possible politically to talk about, and yet it's coming, right? And it should come to Canada because Canada is one of the countries, along with other countries of the West, which has, you know, I would argue, is committing a genocide of negligence, right? In how countries of the global south are suffering and have been suffering for a long time due to climate, which they have not contributed to, the climate catastrophes, right? And they've been victimized by climate catastrophes. And so as people will be increasingly making the choice of to move or to die, basically, Canada needs to be responsive to that, right? And I see it increasing here, right? And again, it's not talked about that much politically, but I think it will need to be, and it should be, and Canada needs to face that in order to be fair and just in a planetary context, we actually need to be accepting and welcoming migrants. People coming.
I think this is a really important question that is really not getting enough attention. I think we keep talking about growth and people are moving here because it's a nice place to live. Technology, you know, enables it, you know, et cetera. I think a lot of people are at the doorstep or will be at our doorstep, you know, wanting to come to live in places like this, you know, in Canada, across Canada, and certainly in Atlantic Canada in large measure. And I think we have to understand what that means in terms of the environment as a whole, in terms of the quality of life that we're providing, in terms of how we build in a way which is humane and responsible and all the rest of it. For me, it's actually challenging the whole idea of urbanization that kind of has existed for some time. That is, that growth basically happens in cities that keep getting kind of bigger and bigger and expanding out in large measure. I think in Atlantic Canada, you know, given the earlier question about rural kind of growth, I think it's going to happen in a different way, and that it's better maybe if it happens in a better way. But we have to stop thinking that all of that is going to be auto-dependent, because from a climate change point of view, that is just not responsible. That's not the responsible thing to do. So this is the moment of change. You started your talk with the idea of change. You know, it's not just that we have to change our conception of what's possible. We have to change the things that we do and what we aspire to in a way that kind of accepts this kind of idea that the whole world is changing. You know, populations are shifting, being forced to one part of the world, from one part of the world to another, because there's war, because there are sandstorms when there shouldn't be, because there are floods, you know, in large measure in other places. You know, the world is actually kind of on the brink of not being able to deal with those things. We're in a fairly reasonable kind of position to be able to deal with them, but it's going to take the kind of imagination that Jayne was talking about, you know, to see our way through it. Otherwise, we're always coming from the back, you know. We're always reacting to the next crisis, the next wave of immigrants, the next whatever the next storm, you know, whatever it is. And I have to tell you that takes more energy, and that will cost more money, and that will be much more destructive to people's individual lives. We should take this opportunity to actually improve our quality of life generally and for everyone, as opposed to wait for these crises to happen and then have to spend enormous sums of money just to recover to a kind of acceptable level.
Yeah, and that's like speaking to like being proactive rather than reactive.
Yeah.
And it's much easier to be proactive than it is to be reactive, but it does take ambition and innovation that we've been having a hard time seeing within our government, and specifically within the housing sector. So what about businesses needing foot traffic? For example, Plateau, Mount Royal, and Montreal, despite having much more density than the Halifax neighborhoods, they have issues surrounding this. And could rent control be a possible solution to this? Yeah, rent control may not be perfect, but could it help? Oh, okay. 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 So which would you like to pick?
We could spend an hour talking about walkable cities if you'd like, and the conflict between people and cars and all the rest of it. But maybe the quick answer I think from me would be that really there isn't really a conflict at the end of the day. That we have to get over this idea that cars have rights. I think that it's all about people at the end of the day, and everyone is a walker at the end of the day. It's like you can't, mostly, there are very few people that can actually drive into their kitchen or living room or whatever it is. And the idea that from a health point of view, social point of view, etc., there are all sorts of benefits to having more walking, less traffic, and much better public transit systems as a way to get from one place to another. I think there are solutions, and we shouldn't make the problem sound overwhelming.
I'd love to respond to that because I happen to live on Plateau, Mount Royal, in Montreal, so that's home for me. And actually, we have a situation that addresses both of your questions, right? I don't own a car. In fact, I lived there 18 years and never drove. I only started to. I became a member of a car-sharing co-op last year for the first time. But I can walk to everything, and I have kids, and I do all shopping on foot, just about everything on foot or on bike, or public transit in the winter. I'm not a year-round cyclist, but the point is, it's highly walkable, and it's mostly 3-story housing, 2- and 3-story housing, but it's one of the densest neighborhoods in all of North America, especially Canada and U.S. I'm not sure about Mexico and other parts of North America, but for sure in Canada, U.S., it's one of the densest. So yeah, the business density is very high, small business density, right? So that's one thing. And there's rent control, right? And I think, if I understand right, I'd love to hear about rent control here, if it even exists at all. But rent control is one of the things that saves, keeps Plateau Mont Royal as diverse as it is, because it also has one of the highest concentrations of artists and musicians in all of Canada, which of course can't afford super high rent. That said, rents are still going up because landlords seem to find ways around it, but the rent control has helped a lot. And of course, there's more of a culture of renting. I rent. I don't own property. I rent there, and it's very usual for people to rent. So culture of renting is quite strong. But I'd love to hear your perspectives, Kevin.
Well, my perspective on car usage or walkable cities, to kind of go back to Montreal. The last time I was in Montreal, I just spent the whole week kind of in awe of people's capacity for organic community, togetherness. I would see people in parks and, speaking with what, as far as I could tell, were relative strangers. They were just bumping into each other and having a conversation, like a real conversation. And to me, there is a connection between car culture and the inability to have a conversation with somebody that you just, isn't in your network, right? And I guess as far as that goes, I think there's going to be compromises, there's going to be choices to be made in the systems that we want to put into place. Some of them have, certain benefits and certain functionalities, but, what are the values, what are the principles, what are the ultimate goals we want to achieve with the systems we put in place? For me, having, an interwoven, inclusive community is far more important than simply facilitating business interests at every turn. Like, it's just not even a question for me as to which one I would choose. As far as rent control is concerned, I think the way I see rent control, it's a necessary intervention in a system that has just gone wild, right? We need, it's just something we need to put in place to stabilize, individual households, but, to stabilize society in a much greater way. I guess from a broader perspective, I would say it's kind of beside the point. Rent control is only necessary when you've commodified housing, right? Like, you don't need to control rent when the housing isn't subject to such crazy inflationary pressures. If housing is a nonprofit venture, rent control it's beside the point, right? So to me, we need to put in a system in place, whether or not that's replacing the existing system as a whole, I don't know, but I do think through community land trusts and other methods, there's an opportunity to put into place a separate and independent system that operates on a wholly different set of values and principles, and in that circumstance, things like rent control just become moot.
So in saying that, I know that the Taiwok Housing Association, which is an Indigenous non-for-profit housing organization, they charge 30% of the inhabitants' income, and all of the rent that's received from that person goes back into the organization for maintenance or building, repairs, whatever that may be. And I'm wondering if that's a feasible option or something that we might like to see more of in Halifax.
I think it's definitely got some value, to investigate. I would say, yeah, that's kind of an ideal scenario in which you are, again, returning whatever revenue you're pulling in back into the system to make it better, to make it more sustainable, to provide better opportunities for people, to expand opportunities for people who don't currently have, don't have access to that system. So I think what it probably requires is, an examination of some of the kind of fixed costs, the other costs that are coming into play when you're developing housing that drive up costs from the very beginning. I think it goes back to that question about, can cities exist without developers developing? They're pulling in a lot of money through, these fixed development costs. Should we be applying those to nonprofit housing? Should we be applying those to, the types of systems that are, providing stability in people's lives? I would argue not, but you do have to replace those funds somehow. Cities do need money to operate. So it's hard to kind of separate one piece out from the other. There's a domino effect. As soon as you start toying with one, you have to consider its effects on that next piece. But I think that's where we are. I think we just have to consider the whole system, and examples like Taiwok just give you some insight as to how you might start approaching a new way of doing things.
So this person asked, is the federal government gives millions of dollars to the province for housing? Where does this money go? I don't see it actually going to the low and affordable housing costs.
Yeah, I don't know where it goes either. Is the Minister of Housing here? Yeah, I think you may be aware, the province has asked the HRM and other communities, I think as well, to find ways to expedite, housing developments, et cetera. I know that HRM is trying to find ways in which they could meet some of the housing requirements for people in dire need of housing. So maybe some of that money will go there. It's not like there aren't many places where the money could go, but I really don't know where it is that it's allocated to go.
In many cases, it's going to private developers, who are signing contracts with limited obligations. And so, it's really, again, kind of going back to that idea that there's a gap in the system in terms of development capacity dedicated to affordable housing in the long term. It's really falling upon developers who know the business and can write a proposal that government will, respond to positively. They're the ones accessing that money. It's a bit different in bigger cities, Vancouver, Toronto, where you've got nonprofits with development experience and they, know how to put together a proposal that government will support. But we're not there in this community for the most part. And so it's the developers who are accessing that in some cases. But I will say too, the obligations that go along with a lot of those funding streams, especially with the National Housing Program, are quite onerous. And there's certainly good intentions behind them, accessibility, environmental standards, and all that. But they do introduce costs to a project, and for a private developer looking for profit at the end of the day, a lot of the time they just look at it and say, you're putting too many financial obligations on me. It's affecting my bottom line. I'm not interested. They'll just go to a private lender and find the financing. So we've struggled to really get that money flowing here in Atlantic Canada because those who would really have the interest in using it just can't put together a proposal that CMHC will respond to positively.
So maybe the question is, how do we develop, that right. sector? How do we get in the game of actually being able to do that?
Yeah, and I would say that is an in-progress type endeavor. The provincial government is putting money into building capacity within the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector itself is getting together. Next week, there's the launch of a provincial nonprofit housing association. The intention is to start kind of pooling those resources, pooling that capacity. I'm involved with a community land trust project. Again, it's just really trying to kind of put that ability in the hands of the people who have their eye on the prize, specifically, uniquely. So it's in development. I guess what I see is the unfortunate reality is we've had the people who are traditionally responsible for ensuring that affordable housing was made available, either through large capital funding opportunities or the actual development and management of housing, federally and provincially. They've kind of backed away from that and expecting somebody else to fill the void, I think. I see it pretty cynically with respect to an idea of supply and demand kind of model, assuming that if there was a demand for housing, the private sector would fill it. That has just proven not to be the case. And if the private sector isn't doing it, the nonprofit sector was the only one left, and they just aren't able. So for a good number of years now, we've just had this kind of stalemate where nothing much was happening at all. I think we're starting to get past that, but housing, at any scale is a long and complicated game, especially with respect to a lot of the factors Frank was talking about. You don't get it done quickly and easily. There's a lot of layers, a lot of complexity, so we got a lot of catch up to do, but I think we're somewhat on our way.
And in respect to proposal writing and not being able to access the funds, because the proposals aren't to the standard of government or whoever's making the decisions on these standards, I think that disconnect is almost intentional. Whereas regular people, laymen who don't have tons of university education or formal education or the experience, aren't given the opportunity or support to be able to do these things, and specifically from government. So it's my opinion that there should be aid from the government to access these supports that the government is supplying. Because you can put the support there, but not everybody's going to be able to access it or know about it. And I think if the government were to like instate some sort of initiative where like they help these nonprofit organizations to create proposals that would be acceptable to them, or to figure out that process, or for the government to create, I don't know, some education around that, that would negate some of the issues that they're facing.
And I give credit where credit is due. I've heard from a couple of nonprofits lately who are saying the province has really stepped up their game in that regard. They are working through the process with those proponents. You know, they are trying to help develop that capacity in kind of a specific project context, but you know, at a kind of broader organizational level, you know, so that they can pursue other projects going forward. So I think government has woken up to that. You know, I do think there's probably some intentionality in the structure of those systems that has limited the ability of, you know, smaller players with less familiarity with the system over time. But I think in general, it does just go back to this kind of like technocratic kind of myopathy, right? Like just can't see past it. We build these systems according to expert advice, and that expert advice is inherently alienating. It's inherently like, you know, it just cuts people out of the process right away. I don't know if it's intentional. It's just like a consequence of our limited thinking.
Right, and saying that in relation to saying that people with lived experience can build just as well as people who have gone to school for it. And those resources are going unused and unappreciated when in fact, like, that could probably solve a lot of the issues that we're facing, or at least be part of the solution to the issue.
You know, we don't value wisdom and experience in the society. It's all like what the resume tells you, right? Like, do you have credentials? Do you have, you know, have you worked for a particular company for an amount of time? Like, I mean, it's just, we're really denying ourselves opportunity for evolving. You know, we just are not considering all of the potential in the system. We're always denying people who have the right and the ability to do certain things, you know, based on hierarchy and just, again, limited thinking. So yeah, I'm not going to start on that rant, but I feel it like it's just, yeah, we're handcuffed at almost every turn in that regard.
Well, I think that touches like greatly into participatory cities, and in smaller communities, and from experience, the urban Indigenous community, I know that we put a lot of value on lived experience, and we try to put those people in positions of knowledge and support in other people, because that doesn't go unvalued. I mean, that experience comes with knowledge and a better way of doing things, and that's exactly what participatory cities is working towards, if you want to touch on that a little bit.
Sure, and there are other people here who could speak to this. But yeah, I mean, the idea with participatory city fundamentally is to value the creativity, the ideas of everyone. That everyone has lived experience, everyone has great ideas, and to be welcoming and inviting people into a space to be able to co-create and to have the support they need to develop their ideas collaboratively with others. And in fact, I think it was just today that actually, as part of the Everyone Everyday part, a community build trailer launched, I think today, which is about making, if anybody has questions about it afterwards, there are colleagues right here who are involved in that and were there today. But yeah, about making specifically, and I think today they were working on making furniture, but you know, they could build a wiki house too, right? Or other kind of, you know, that could translate into self-building homes at some stage, would be really interesting, I think. So yeah, we are starting to put some of that participatory systemic infrastructure into place, and who knows whether that could connect with housing at some stage. That would be beautiful, wouldn't it?
I don't want to miss the opportunity to say that I think that's a lot of what this library series is about, is trying to pull new people into the conversation around housing. There's been far too few community members involved in this effort for a long time, and to me that is really one of the primary roots of the situation we're in. We've just left it to too few people with too few ideas and bound by the systems that they're responsible to, and we're just, we're suffering the consequences at this point. It's a crisis that requires far more people involved, and it's too important an issue for people to stand back and say, well, it's not my responsibility. Like, I don't have that job. I'll leave it to somebody else.
So beautifully said, Kevin. I couldn't agree more. And yeah, again, hats off to the library. And I just love that this is hosted by the library system, a really inclusive way to have these discussions, to invite imagination, and where probably imagination capacity is much higher than inside of governments, to be frank.
Right. And I was also moved, I think I said before, by the comments that I read that people left, that were played, some of which were, on the screen earlier. But I think it wasn't just comments of, something needs to be done and I need help and, why can't I find a place to live and what kind of trade-offs am I being asked to make. There were also people that were saying, I have too much housing, It's like I'm living in an empty house, basically, and other people were saying, I don't have nearly enough room in my house. And if you put those two comments together, it seems to me that you have the beginnings of a kind of solution, not to the whole problem. But if we stop thinking about housing being kind of one solution, that's going to solve everything, but things that we can do in a kind of on-the-ground sort of way based on our local understanding of what it is that's going on, building on the kind of institutions that exist here, and the fact that, it seems to me that someone is asking for people to live with them, to kind of share a resource that they have, and other people are looking for exactly that resource. And what we need is kind of like a table or a desk or a place or a noteboard or a few people or an organization that actually puts those things together. And this is not so far-fetched. I mean, Jayne and I were talking about this earlier. There's an initiative in Boston that I've heard of, which matches elderly people who actually are living in large houses, frequently apartments, with music students who actually need a place to live. And it seems like such a beautiful kind of idea. It could work with all sorts of groups, it seems to me. But these things are actually being done in other parts of the world. And I think there's and it's just this idea of kind of not looking at kind of large government answers to everything, but trying to find answers like from the bottom up as well.
Well, I grew up in a household that took in exchange students. So the NI, something like that, National Exchange Student Program, something like this. Yeah. And people from all over the world would come and stay with us for a year, maybe sometimes 3 or 4 years, and study, do what they have to do in Canada. We provide the meals, we provide the house, the room, and it's more than that. It's more than a place to stay. It's about cross-cultural mingling and like being open-minded and learning from the people that you bring in just as much as you teach them about your culture and your ways of being here in North America as to what they're doing in Asia or Europe, wherever it may be. And it does work. Like it's something that is happening right now, being facilitated by this organization, NSISP. And it's a great solution, I think. And personally, I've grown up much more open-minded, educated, open to cultural diversity, and interested in those kind of things than some of my peers who had never been exposed to different cultures and lots of diversity like this. So in sharing space, you share experience, and that's just as important, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks.
I think, you know, in some respects, what we have to do is just start exposing people to, you know, different ideas, different models. You know, just put something in front of them. I think that imagination in the absence of alternatives is really hard for people. You know, you need to kind of be able to see something, touch something, kind of experience it at least, you know, vicariously from the outside, and to start putting what you have into perspective. So, you know, I think even at those small scales, some of these alternative models can have real influence. It's just about, I think it's important though to kind of, you know, chronicle them, to kind of celebrate them, to really share the information so people kind of get a sense of other ways of doing what we have kind of come to take for granted.
And I think there's like a large theme of learned helplessness at the fault of, you know, these bigger organizations and the government. But I think with like the ability to think outside of the box, like there's a lot that can happen. And now people are being forced to think outside of the box because there's no other choice to, right?
I see people leaving.
Yeah, it's 5:42, so maybe I'll wrap up.
Yeah, I just noticed that too. Right.
So I would like to thank Jayne Engle and Frank Palermo for providing us with their opinions on community-driven public housing and possibilities of what that could look like for us here in Jabuktuk and Halifax. Thank you to Kevin Hooper for joining the discussion and providing knowledge of his work in the community development and in the housing sector here in Halifax. And a huge thank you to all of you who took time out of your day to come and participate in this discussion about participatory community-driven public housing approaches and what that could look like when addressing the current housing crisis that we're experiencing in our city. So